Welcome everyone, and thank you for joining us for today's webinar, Ensuring a Successful Access Control Strategy for Medical Devices. I'm Chris Higgins, Marketing Programs Manager with Imprivata, and I'll be your host for today's session. I'm excited to be joined today by Rachel Pickering, Product Marketing Manager here at Imprivata. Welcome, Rachel.
Thanks, Chris.
I'm going to turn it over to Rachel in just a minute, but before I do, I have a few quick housekeeping items for our audience. First, everyone who registered for today's session will receive a recording of the webinar. Second, if you have any trouble with the audio or video today, try logging out and logging back in again, which in most cases should resolve the issue. And finally, please feel free to ask questions at any time via the Q&A panel on the right-hand side of your screen, and we'll leave some time at the end to get to everyone's questions. All right, that's enough for me. Turn it over to Rachel to get us started.
All right, thanks, Chris, and thanks everybody for taking the time to join. This is a topic that I think is starting to become more and more popular with folks as device connectivity continues to grow throughout the health system. So what I want to do today is spend a little bit of time talking about really what the state of medical device security is today. It's one of those things that you see in headlines on a daily basis, yet there's still, after about a year and a half, 2 years of concerns, there's no clear-cut answer on what a healthcare system should do. I want to talk about really what those key concerns and challenges are and why there isn't quite a clear-cut answer yet. Understanding, what's out there to guide you today, what resources you have to help start to implement better security procedures for these connected medical devices. I'll talk about some of the concerns that we see with customers today around employing security protocols and making sure that they're effective and that they do not interfere with clinical workflows. I'll talk about how to choose the best authentication modality for the different area of care that you're looking at and for the different devices. And then I'll talk a little bit about why it's so critical to make sure that you find that proper balance between security and convenience to make sure that not only are you improving your security posture for medical devices, but that you're also doing so in a way that is beneficial and productive for clinicians. So the state of medical device security today, it's top of mind, like I said, and it's something that people are starting to think about and chime in more and more on with each month. There's a couple of key concerns that are starting to drive conversations toward more strict regulation or guidance on what healthcare should do, what medical device manufacturers should do, and what each party is responsible for. Right now, we're starting to see folks chime in from NIST, from the FDA, from the Department of Health and Human Services, as well as a number of other areas, to talk about really what is the problem and what do we need to focus on? Because if we have a better understanding of what that problem is and what the risks are, it's a lot easier to come to a succinct solution. But when it comes down to it, really there's a couple of key factors that health systems should be concerned with. There's a lot of work that the medical device manufacturers are doing today to help shore up their devices, to make sure that they're easier to patch, to make sure that operating systems are supported. But from a healthcare provider's perspective, the concerns really come down to a few key areas. HIPAA violations is obviously first and foremost. You've got these connected devices, and we'll go into this in a little bit more detail, but they can open your organization up to risk for HIPAA fines if not managed properly. Exposure to PHI, whether it is from a malicious actor inside your hospital or a third party trying to exfiltrate information through a cyber attack, that's starting to become something that's really critical for folks to get their head around. And then ultimately, because of the different risks that are out there, because of how ingrained medical devices are now to the delivery of care, there's ultimately that lingering, luring fear of potentially having an impact to care. So from a clinical standpoint, the concerns are really mostly about availability and patient safety, right? Making sure that somebody cannot change information, change patient information, vitals on a device before sending it over to the AHR. Make sure that somebody can't take these devices offline so that a clinician isn't able to get in there and do what they need to do. Denial of service attacks, things like that start to become a big concern. And then obviously from the IT side of things, it's really more about some of that fundamental security, right? Unauthorized access to your network or using access to get to different connected devices, improper disposal of PHI, data integrity and accuracy. So from the IT perspective, it's really all about confidentiality and integrity. Unfortunately, failure to properly secure networked and non-networked devices can lead to a whole host of problems. And it's really important to make sure that you've got your head wrapped around what needs to be done to make sure that it doesn't happen to you. So I'm going to take a little bit of time going into a bit more detail about what these concerns are. Altered PHI on a device can lead to both data integrity concerns for the organization, as well as potential patient safety and health concerns, especially when it comes to things like diagnostic devices. On the same token, device reprogramming, whether due to malware or by an unauthorized user within the healthcare facility, can also lead to patient safety issues, right? You're in healthcare, and ultimately what everything comes down to is about the patient. Denial of service attacks, the same thing, right? If you can't get in there and do what you need to do and provide that care, it's problematic. But I think, far away, what it really comes down to is unauthorized access, whether it's to the device, to the data stored on the device, to other devices in the network, to other systems in the network. If you can start to control that unauthorized access, you can really start to quell a lot of these key concerns. In fact, based on recent studies that have come out that have taken a deeper dive into the different cybersecurity vulnerabilities reported by medical device organizations over the past several years, it's becoming clear that the majority of vulnerabilities that have been reported have to do with user authentication. So whether it's somebody getting their hands on a device and directly performing some sort of a malicious activity then and there within the hospital because that device was left unlocked, or someone accessing these devices remotely via the network, what it's turning out to be the case is that in order to access one of these devices remotely, generally you have to have gotten your hands on that device first to be able to get into the back end, get your hands on a USB port, something like that. So really it still fundamentally comes down to that basic security practice of managing user authentication for these connected devices. So with that, as I mentioned, organizations and departments are starting to talk a little bit about what should be going on, who has the onus for the responsibility of security for these devices. Primarily today, most of that conversation has been around medical device manufacturers, what they should be doing and implementing to make sure that these devices are supported. But there's also a lot that the healthcare provider can do to make sure that they are in compliance and make sure that they're closing down those gaps and those loopholes as well. From a HIPAA compliance standpoint, just as recently as this past May, DHHS stood up and decided to really address this concern in this open question by clarifying how they defined a computing device. So for a very long time, it was really laptops and desktop computers that were thought of as the primary risk factor for a HIPAA breach or a HIPAA exposure. But because of the increased connectivity of these medical devices, of shared mobile devices in your environment, the DHHS felt that it was necessary to rephrase that language to make sure that healthcare providers knew that any device in your environment that pulls PHI, that accesses it and stores it in some way, can be a risk to a HIPAA fine. So organizations need to get a better handle on what that is and what they can do about it. Similarly, California just came out with a mandate. Organizations have until 2020 to find ways to better secure their Internet of Things, right? And network-connected medical devices falls under that. So if you're in California, this is a big concern. And I think that now that California has something, most other states will be close to follow. And so really what it comes down to is that people are coming out and saying, you have to be more secure, you have to find a way to secure these devices, lock them down. But beyond best practices, like from NIST and SANS, there's not much else guidance that they're giving. What it really comes down to and what they're talking about is strong authentication, whether it be single or two-factor authentication. The key to a successful security strategy really is about finding ways to establish trust between the people and the technology that they're interacting with, and then that information that's being shared throughout your network. So again, data integrity is a huge concern that security bodies are starting to look at and say, how do you make sure you maintain this within your environment? Cybersecurity, another concern. How do you put those security fundamentals in place to make sure that your organization and your patients aren't at risk? And then finally, HIPAA compliance, again, is something that's starting to crop up as a big concern for these devices that can store or transmit PHI. One of the biggest roadblocks that hospitals see, though, is how do they implement a new security measure without getting in the way of productivity? Because if you don't roll something out properly, if you don't have clinical workflows in mind, you're either going to run into technology adoption issues or you're going to run into security compliance issues. So I want to talk a little bit more about that. Because as I mentioned, it's clear to see that the people who are speaking up and talking about what a security strategy should look like, the one really common factor between all the parties is the idea that you have to authenticate users. You have to be able to tell who is doing what on these devices at what time to be able to improve your security. Unfortunately, this can often create barriers to care, right? If you think about the sheer number of times that clinicians are logging in and out of these lockdown medical devices, you think about the pain that they get, the frustration from logging in and out of a laptop or a desktop computer. You can really amplify that because medical devices, shared mobile devices, other connected devices in your environment generally weren't designed with authentication in mind. So oftentimes what you see is that the workflows are very cumbersome, they are time-consuming, and they lead to frustration for the clinicians. So hospitals are looking at the situation and kind of stuck between a rock and a hard place, saying, well, I want to enforce this security, but I really don't know how to without really getting in the way of clinical care. So you're either staring at the face of security risks or you're staring at clinicians who have an unfavorable workflow. And ultimately, even if you do put security measures in place, if that workflow is unfavorable, what it's going to do is lead to security workarounds, which, totally negate what you've put in place. Too often, increased security measures can contribute to a decline in provider efficiency, productivity, and satisfaction. Introducing additional workflows or cumbersome tasks in the name of security can often have unintended impacts as clinicians and other users employ workarounds to mitigate frustration associated with the new security measures. For some devices, such as a patient spot check monitor, clinicians might have to log into that device 20-plus times a day. So in order to have a successful access control strategy, you have to plan for some of the most common workarounds ahead of time so that you can be sure that you're not going to open up unknown risk. Obviously, from an organizational standpoint, the first and foremost is not requiring credentials or removing the need for credentials. The security and compliance risks of this are, compounded with each device that you have in your environment. is really limitless. They range anywhere from HIPAA fine, like we talked about, to an entire network compromise as these devices are more and more connected. And so you start to have security concerns, data integrity concerns. It's just not smart, right? So now you have to look at, okay, what can I do? I can put in passwords. I can require user authentication. But if that workflow's not easy enough to do, you're going to run into the common things like password or credential sharing, or folks signing in and leaving it logged in all day, in which case you've got auditability issues. You're not able to go in and see who did what and really trust that information. And I think what else is really top of mind for organizations as they invest in this new technology is the idea that clinicians just simply won't adopt the technology, right? They'll circumnavigate this interoperability that you've put into place. You know, we can go back to the example of a patient monitor again. If a nurse has to go in and log into this device 25 times a day for each patient during each round, and they run into roadblocks every single time they do that, you're going to have them go back to things like manual charting or writing down notes on the back of their glove or on their leg. Not only does that remove the ability for you to leverage that real-time visibility that these smart devices bring to your environment, but you're also opening up to things like human error from batch entry and the inability to leverage those clinical decision-making tools that you have. So ultimately, that starts to lead into patient safety concerns as well. And one of the biggest reasons why we see security workarounds like this is because the authentication modalities do not take into account the clinical workflows that are surrounding them. So before implementing any sort of authentication, it's really important to understand what's best for the care setting that you're about to deploy it in. There are a few considerations for a security strategy that you need to take a look at. First and foremost is workflow variability. You know, take a look at when, where, and how often this authentication would be required. It's really important to understand the care setting in which the authentication will happen. For example, FIPS-compliant biometric authentication might make sense in some areas of the hospital, such as a shared workstation or a nurse's station, but it might not be as practical in care settings where, say, gloves are required. Similarly, while a proximity card is convenient and easily accessible during regular patient interactions, that might not be the best approach in, say, an operating room, right? So therefore, you need to be able to offer flexible authentication that gives the user the option of more than one modality to help account for the varying scenarios. The next thing that you want to look at is what levels of authentication you need. What kind of data are you protecting, and what implications are there for failing to protect that? So when we talk about levels of authentication, we're usually talking about single-factor versus two-factor authentication. This is another thing that you want to take into consideration during evaluation of an access control strategy. You really want to think about when and where to employ single-factor authentication or two-factor. The FDA today stresses the importance of ensuring that authentication not interfere with patient care. So it's important to consider what level of security is required and practical for each situation. Some workflows, such as transmitting blood pressure or temperature, might only require one level of security, whereas other workflows might require multiple factors, either due to internal mandates or government regulations. Right, think about medication dispensing in certain states like Ohio. So you want to consult with both the clinical and compliance teams to understand which option makes the most sense for your medical devices and the care settings. The other one we want to talk about is clinical productivity and the idea of having flexible trust. It may or may not make sense to require full authentication every single time a device is accessed in certain areas. But one of the largest roadblocks to access control compliance is the burden put on clinicians to repeatedly enter user credentials throughout the day. So you want to consider implementing grace periods to further streamline authentication once a user has been established as trusted. In selecting the proper time frame for a grace period for a medical device, it's really important to understand how clinicians are using each device in the field. And a grace period for one type of device, like a spot check vitals monitor, might need to be different than that for an infusion pump or another medical device. So again, communicate with your clinicians, take stock of how they are using each device, make sure that you're tightly aligned so that you can put in the right parameters to make sure that you're both achieving the goals that you want. And then finally, promoting patient safety. So break glass considerations require you to consider multiple modality options to ensure that trusted clinicians can access these devices throughout various methods in the event that one isn't available. So for example, a patient vitals monitor again. It might be configured to accept a proximity badge for a trusted user, as well as the manual entry of username and password in the event they don't have that badge for some reason. It could also be configured to allow you to capture data, but only transmit it after authentication. That way you're not pushing unauthenticated information to other parts of your network, so you're still able to easily and quickly access care, get those vitals, do what you need to do to assess any immediate health concerns, and then just restrict some of the follow-up activities later. We do have a couple of tips for success that we like to share from some of our customers who have successfully deployed this in their environments. One comes from a customer who suggests using audit logs during a brief discovery period prior to implementing a full strategy. And what this will allow you to do is get that baseline of activity to really understand how clinicians are interacting with these devices to better align those grace periods with the actual clinical workflows. The other one from an IT perspective in terms of managing these grace periods is to start sessions short and increase them over time as you feel more comfortable with the trust and the authentication. It's always easier to extend a grace period than to shorten one down. So you want to start out short and then keep close eye to make sure that they don't become burdensome. So what this really all comes down to is finding that right balance between security and convenience to make sure the measures that you take within your environment are adopted and are successful without getting in the way of clinician care. Imprivata has a streamlined solution to help with Internet of Medical Things access, specifically medical devices as well as other connected devices in your environment. And if you're familiar with Imprivata at all, it operates on the idea that we're bringing the same trusted, familiar workflows that we use in other areas of the hospital and these security enhancements now to these connected devices that are really just starting to crop up on everybody's radar. So we're able to give you the who, what, and when so that you can better manage and assess what's going on with your devices, who's accessing them, at what time, so that you can understand the information that's being passed back and forth in your environment. Imprivata Medical Device Access is our solution to enable secure and convenient user authentication for medical devices. And what we're able to do with that is improve security by making that secure authentication practical. The way we do that is by ensuring that the workflows are efficient, replacing manual username and password entry with a fast automated proximity card authentication. With that, not only are you able to quell concerns over HIPAA compliance, but you're able to increase visibility into the interactions with these devices and ultimately enable adoption of the connected device technology by removing barriers. Again, this is a huge concern for a lot of organizations who are implementing new technology. How do I make sure that people are using these robust tools that I'm putting into place? So by making sure that the security measures you need also meet the requirements of the users who access them every day, that's going to allow you to get where you need to be. Today we have integrations with a number of leading medical device vendors within the U.S. market. We have a few internationally as well. Primarily we focus on patient monitoring as well as medication storage and dispensing carts. So we have integrations today with Philips, Welch-Allyn, and Capsule on the patient monitoring side, as well as Howard Medical on the medication storage cart side. And this is a pretty simple API integration that you're able to enable within your environment for the devices that are already in there, legacy devices or net new devices. If you're curious about any of the specifics or which models we integrate with, let me know and we can follow up with that after the session. But really what it comes down to, and we sort of touched upon this, is what streamlined authentication can do for your organization. First and foremost, for the clinicians, you can reduce the time to log in by 90%. So we go back to being able to save a lot of time each day so that nurses and other clinicians can spend more time in front of the patients and less time getting frustrated trying to log in to different devices. And from an IT perspective, it's really all about being able to put tighter security controls in place without fear of them being avoided. So not only are you going to allow for tighter controls, but you can improve compliance on those controls. Ultimately, again, it's that finding the balance between security and convenience to make sure that everybody's needs are met. And with that, I'll turn it over to Chris for any questions.
Great, thank you, Rachel. You certainly covered a lot of information, so I hope that everyone listening found it to be informative. As Rachel said, now is the time to get to your questions. So as a reminder, please enter your questions into the Q&A box on the right-hand side of your screen. And please be sure to use the question box and not the chat box. We'll just give folks a minute or so to enter their questions. Okay, Rachel, we have our first question, and this person asks, if I already have VitalSign monitors connected to my EMR, do I need to buy more hardware to enable a single sign-on workflow?
That's a good question. So if you are already an Imprivata customer, that will enable you based on the appliances that you already have running OneSign or ConfirmID. From a device hardware perspective, it really depends on what devices you have in place. So I'd have to follow up with you on the specific vendors that you guys have. Some of them, depending on the age of the device, the readers are inherent to the device, so they automatically come with the device. Sometimes it may be that you need to add on a small proximity reader, a dongle, or something like that to enable it if they are a legacy device. But we can work through that on a one-off depending on who you guys have in-house today.
Great, thanks, Rachel. We have another question. This person would like to know what EMR systems can this solution be utilized with?
That's a good question. From an Imprivata standpoint, we are EMR agnostic, so whoever you have in-house, we're able to work with. From the medical device vendor side, they are also all EMR agnostic, so as long as you already have the tools in place to connect those devices to the EMR at a server level, we can communicate with that server to ensure the authentication.
Great, thanks, Rachel. Well, great. I think that wraps up our question and answer session. So with that said, I want to thank everyone again for joining us for today's presentation. This concludes our webinar. Take care.
Thanks.